My name is Dorothy Hale, and I am 71 years old, and I woke up from a 19-day coma on a Tuesday morning in March to discover that my son had sold my house. I want to start with the waking, because the waking is where everything begins, and because I think it is important to understand what it feels like to come back from 19 days of nothing. Before I tell you what I found when I arrived, the first thing I noticed was the ceiling. Not my ceiling, a hospital ceiling, white and institutional, and utterly without the crack in the plaster above my bedroom window that I had been meaning to repair for 11 years, and had come to think of as a feature. The crack was how I always knew I was home. The absence of it told me immediately where I was, before I was fully conscious enough to process anything else. The second thing I noticed was Thomas, my son, 38 years old, and sitting in the chair beside my bed, with the specific posture of a man who has been sitting in that chair for a long time and has developed a particular relationship with waiting. He was looking at his phone when my eyes opened. Then he looked up, and his face did the thing that faces do when something they have been hoping for has arrived, and the arriving produces a feeling too large for immediate expression. He said, "Mom." I said, "Thomas." My voice was not what it usually was. 19 days is a long time, and the body requires reacquainting itself with the things it does. But it was my voice. I was in it. I was back. The doctors came. The tests were done. The explanations were given with the careful language of people who understand that someone who has just regained consciousness is not immediately ready for complex information, and who layer it in accordingly. I had had a stroke. It had been severe. My recovery was going to take time. I was, by any measure, fortunate to be having this conversation. I spent the first 4 days being fortunate, accepting the fortunate, holding the fortunate, with the grateful grip of a woman who had been very close to a different outcome, and understood it completely. Before I tell you about day 4, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city in the comments. I love knowing where you are when you listen to this. Now let me tell you what I asked Thomas on day 4 and what he said. On day 4, I asked about my house. Not because it was the most important thing, because it was a practical thing. And I have always been a practical woman. And practical women think about their houses, and their gardens, and their cats named Gerald, who have specific opinions about feeding schedules. I said, "Thomas, has someone been looking after the house?" He said, "Mom, I need to talk to you about the house." I looked at him. He had the posture of a man who has been preparing a conversation and is now incited, and finds it harder than the preparation suggested it would be. I said, "What about the house?" He said, "I made some decisions while you were..." He stopped. He said, "While you were not able to?" I said, "What decisions?" He said, "The medical bills are going to be significant." He said, "The house is a substantial asset." He said, "I had the power of attorney you gave me 3 years ago, and I thought, given the circumstances, given the uncertainty of your..." He stopped again. He said, "I listed the house." I said, "You listed the house?" He said, "Yes." I said, "While I was in the coma?" He said, "Yes." I said, "When?" He said, "Day 7, I said. And he said the offer came in on day 12. I said, and he said, the closing was on day 17. I lay in the hospital bed, and I looked at the ceiling that was not my ceiling, and I thought about the crack in the plaster above my bedroom window that I had been meaning to repair for 11 years. The crack was not there anymore, because my bedroom was not there anymore, because my house was not there anymore, because my son had listed it on day 7 of my coma and closed on day 17, and I had woken up on day 19 to a life that had been reorganized without my knowledge or consent, while I was unconscious in a hospital bed. He said, "Mom, I did what I thought was best." I said nothing. He said, The medical costs are going to be considerable, and the house represented the most liquid, significant asset. And I said, Thomas. He stopped. I said, that was not your decision to make. He said I had the power of attorney. I said, a power of attorney is not permission to sell my home. It is authorization to act on my behalf in specific circumstances, and the specific circumstance it was given for was not this. He said, Mom. I said, give me a phone. I called Francis Delgado from my hospital bed on day 4 of my consciousness, wearing a hospital gown and using Thomas's phone because it was the phone available. Francis was the attorney I had used for my estate planning 3 years earlier, when I had signed the power of attorney that Thomas had used to sell my house. She answered on the second ring. I said, Francis, this is Dorothy Hale, she said. I heard about your stroke. I am so glad you are recovering. I said, Francis, I need to talk to you about the power of attorney. I told her everything Thomas had told me. The listing on day 7, the offer on day 12, the closing on day 17, the fact that I had been unconscious for all of it. Francis listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, Dorothy, I want to ask you some questions. Before I say anything else, I said, ask. She asked about the power of attorney document, the specific language, the scope it had been granted for. I told her what I remembered, and she told me she had the original on file and would review it immediately. She asked whether Thomas had provided documentation to the title company establishing his authority to sell. She asked about the buyer. She asked about the sale price relative to market value. I answered what I could, and I told her I would need her to get the rest from Thomas and from the public record, and she said she would begin immediately. She said, Dorothy, I want to be careful about what I tell you before I have reviewed the documents, because I want to give you accurate information rather than fast information. I said, I understand that. I said, Francis, I need to know one thing right now. She said, ask. I said, was what he did legal? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that depends on the specific language of the power of attorney and on several other factors I need to review, she said. What I can tell you is that a power of attorney given for estate management purposes is typically not intended to authorize the sale of a primary residence during a medical emergency, and that there are arguments available to us that I want to explore before I make any representations. I said, explore them. She said, I will call you tomorrow morning. I said, I will be here. I said it with the specific dry humor of a 71-year-old woman in a hospital gown who does not have a great many other options. And Francis made a sound that was halfway between professional composure and a genuine laugh. I liked her very much in that moment. I had always liked her. I had chosen well when I chose her. Francis called the following morning at 9. Thomas was not in the room. He had come the previous evening, and we had not spoken further about the house because I had told him I had spoken to my attorney and that we should wait for her analysis before continuing the conversation. He had the expression of a man who wanted to say more and had decided that saying more was not the right choice and had left at 8 with the stiff, careful movements of someone who was managing something difficult. Francis told me what she had found. The power of attorney I had given Thomas 3 years ago had been prepared with specific language limiting its scope to financial management decisions in the event of my incapacity, including bill payment, account management, and investment decisions. It had been prepared that way intentionally because I had specifically asked Francis 3 years ago to make sure the document did not give the authority to make major asset decisions without my consent. I said, does that include the house? She said the document explicitly excludes real property transactions. She said, Dorothy, the sale of your home was not within the scope of the authority you granted. She said what Thomas did may constitute an unauthorized transaction. I said, what are my options? She walked me through them. She could file a motion to void the transaction on the grounds that it exceeded the authority granted. The viability of that motion depended on several factors, including the current status of the title transfer and the buyer's knowledge of the power of attorney. Limitations, she said. If the buyer was acting in good faith without knowledge of the limitations, we may not be able to unwind the sale entirely. She said, however, there are other remedies available, including a claim against Thomas personally for the value of the asset he transferred. Without authority, I said. I do not want to sue my son. She was quiet then. She said, Dorothy. What do you want? I said. I want my house, she said. Let me see what I can do. She called me again that afternoon. The title had not yet been recorded in the county records due to a processing delay at the recorder's office. The window was narrow. It was not closed. The motion was filed the following morning. I was still in the hospital when Frances filed it. Still in the gown, still in the bed with the ceiling that was not mine, still working through the daily therapy sessions that were going to be the scaffolding of the next several months of my recovery. I was doing all of that, and also, in the hours between the therapy and the meals, and the doctors who came and went with their careful measured updates, I was running a legal action from a hospital room. Thomas came on the morning Frances filed. He sat in the chair and he said, Mom, I know what you were doing. I said, good. He said, I was trying to help. I said, Thomas, I know you believe that. He said, the bills. I said, the bills were going to be manageable. I said, I have savings. I said, I have insurance. I have resources you did not account for because you did not ask me before you made a decision about my home, he said. You were in a coma, I said. I know I was in a coma, I said. And the correct response to your mother being in a coma is not to list her house on day 7. He said. I panicked. He said it in the voice of a man who has moved past the defensive position and arrived at something more honest. He said, I panicked, and I made a decision. And I did not think it through. And I am sorry I looked at my son. 38 years old, the child I had raised alone from the time he was 4. The person I had given the power of attorney to because I trusted him with the specific trust that a parent gives a child they believe would never use that trust against them. I said, Thomas, I know you panicked, I said. I understand that. Watching your mother in a coma for 19 days is one of the most frightening things that has ever happened to you. I said, I am not without compassion for what those 19 days were. I said, and what you did was still wrong. Not because you are a bad person, because you made a decision that was not yours to make, and you made it during the period when I was least able to prevent it. He said, I know. He said, I am sorry, Mom. He said it with all of the weight it deserved. The motion was successful. The title had not been recorded. The transaction was voided. The buyer was compensated for their costs. From the escrow funds, my house was returned to me. I was discharged 6 weeks after I woke up. Thomas drove me home. We did not speak much on the drive. When we pulled into the driveway, I sat in the passenger seat for a moment and looked at the house. And then I looked at Thomas, and I said, would you like to come in? He said yes. We sat in my kitchen for 2 hours. We talked about the 19 days from his side and from mine. We talked about fear and panic, and what people do when they are terrified and do not know what to do with the terrifying thing. We talked about what the power of attorney was for and what it was not for. And Thomas said he had not read it carefully enough. And I said I knew. And I said that was something we were going to fix. I laughed softly. I made tea. He fixed the crack in the plaster above the bedroom window that I had been meaning to repair for 11 years. He used a kit he had bought at the hardware store on the way over without telling me he was going to do it. Emotional pause when he finished. He came back to the kitchen, and I looked at the ceiling, and the crack was gone. And I thought, there it is. There is home. Recovery is a long road. The physical recovery from a stroke is its own specific journey. And I am making progress. And I am going to continue making progress because I am 71 years old. And I have been making progress my entire life. And I am not going to because stop. Of a ceiling I woke up under. Or a transaction that was voided. Or a son who panicked and made a wrong choice and helped fix the plaster. If you are someone who has been made vulnerable by a health crisis and discovered that vulnerability was used against you, have rights, you have options, and you have the right to exercise them from a hospital bed and a gown. If that is where you find yourself, do not wait until you are stronger. Make the call now. That is my story. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop your city in the comments. Hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.